under the roar of hellfire and the crackle of chains, there's a moment no one ever speaks about, the moment when vengeance hesitates, not out of mercy, but out of recognition. In this world, Hanzo Hasashi does not return from death merely a scorpion, a revenant driven by rage and loss. He returns carrying a fury so old, so complete, that it resonates beyond Netherrealm and Earth alike. It is a fury that does not ask permission. It does not bargain. It simply burns. And somewhere in the dark spaces between judgment and damnation, something ancient takes notice. The spirit of vengeance has always sought the guilty, but has never sought someone who already understands hell as home. When its gaze falls upon Scorpion, the question is not whether he is worthy. The question is whether he is survivable. Because when vengeance chooses vengeance, there may be nothing left to restrain either of them. If you're drawn to stories where power comes at a spiritual cost, where justice and wrath blur until they're indistinguishable, take a moment to support this channel. Like the video, share with others who appreciate darker mythic reimaginings, and subscribe so you don't miss the stories that refuse easy answers. The fire never felt new to Hanzo Hasashi. That was the cruelest part of it. When he rose again as Scorpion, dragged back from death by rage so concentrated it could scar reality itself, the flames did not shock him. They felt familiar, like a pain he'd been carrying long before his body ever burned. Hellfire wrapped around his bones the way memory wraps around regret. Tight enough to define shape, loose enough to never fully release. The Netherrealm did not greet him as a battlefield or a prison. It greeted him as routine. Chains rattled. Screams echoed and faded. Torment cycled endlessly, not as punishment, but as infrastructure. This was a place built to process suffering, and Hanzo understood immediately that it would never run out of him. At first, his purpose was narrow. Names mattered. Faces mattered. The killers of his clan, the architects of his betrayal, the ones whose choices had carved his life into something unrecognizable. He hunted them with the precision of obsession, each confrontation ending in fire and silence. The chains answered him without hesitation, lashing outward as if eager to be used. His enemies burned cleanly, souls consumed by the same hell that had claimed him. There was no hesitation in these moments, no doubt. Vengeance, when it was personal, felt almost peaceful. It gave his existence edges again. But vengeance has a way of widening when it is fed long enough. Between hunts, when the Netherrealm settled into its low, grinding hum, Hanzo began to notice the weight behind certain presences. Some souls burned louder than others. Some carried a density that had nothing to do with the crimes committed against him. Warlords who had never touched his clan. Tyrants from distant realms whose screams echoed differently, as if the hellfire itself recognized them. When he passed near them, his flames flared without command, chains twitching like nerves reacting before thought. At first, he ignored it. Rage had always been loud. He assumed this was no different. It was. The Netherrealm did not teach morality. It taught repetition. And repetition stripped meaning from everything except sensation. Over time, Hanzo realized that his hellfire no longer reacted to memory alone. It reacted to imbalance. The suffering of innocence left a residue in the air, a taste like ash and iron that lingered long after the scream stopped. The more he moved through the realm, the more that residue followed him, clinging to his presence like static. His fire grew hotter in its presence, brighter, more volatile. It was as if his existence had become a beacon, broadcasting something raw and unresolved into spaces far beyond his awareness. He did not know that something was listening, only that the fire was changing. There were moments, rare, unsettling moments, when the flames around his skull dimmed instead of flaring, when the chains hung slack, heavy, as if awaiting judgment rather than delivering it. In those moments, Hanzo felt something unfamiliar press against his consciousness. Not pain, not rage. Wait, the sensation of being evaluated, not as a weapon, but as a principle. It made him furious in a way that had no outlet. He had been judged enough in life. By masters, by enemies, by fate itself. He refused to kneel to another unseen scale. So he did what he had always done. He burned forward. The first time he struck someone who had never crossed his path, the act felt different. The target was a despot whose cruelty had fractured entire cities, whose name was spoken in fear by thousands who would never know Hanzo's face. When Scorpion's chains wrapped around him, there was no recognition in the tyrant's eyes, no understanding of why judgment had arrived. The hellfire consumed him anyway, fast and absolute. The scream that followed was not louder than others, but it carried farther, echoing into places Hanzo could not see. That echo mattered. After that, the Netherrealm began to feel smaller. Corridors twisted subtly, distances compressing as the space itself was responding to his movement. Fire followed him even when he did not summon it, pooling at his feet, licking up walls etched with ancient sigils. Other revenants avoided him, instinctively stepping aside, not out of fear alone, but because something about his presence felt unresolved, unstable. Hanzo did not care. Avoidance was not rejection. It was confirmation. He did not realize that his rage had begun to resemble a signal. Somewhere far beyond the Netherrealm, beyond mortal planes and the simple binaries of good and evil, something ancient stirred. It was not drawn by anger alone. It had seen anger before, worn, wielded it. What reached it now was different. This was vengeance without release, punishment without closure, a force that burned endlessly because it did not believe in endings. To such a presence, that was not noise. It was an invitation. Hanzo felt the first response as pressure behind his eyes, a tightening that made even hellfire feel thin. The flames around his skull burned whiter for a heartbeat, then settled into a deeper, more deliberate glow. His chains moved on their own, clinking softly, as if testing new tension. For the first time since his rebirth, Scorpion hesitated, not because of doubt, because something had finally answered. And when it did, the fire did not ask what he wanted. It asked what he was willing to become. The presence did not announce itself. It did not descend in fire or tear open the sky. It arrived the way inevitability always does. Quietly, already inside the room before you realize the door is gone. Hanzo felt it first as resistance. His hellfire, once wild and instinctive, began to move with intention that was not entirely his own. When he summoned flame, it answered, but slower, heavier, as if passing through a second before manifesting. The chains no longer struck immediately. They coiled. They waited. That waiting gnawed at him more than any blade ever had. He lashed out harder, because that was all he knew. In the Netherrealm, force had always clarified hierarchy. He tore through revenants and war souls alike, his fire roaring high enough to turn the ground glassy beneath his feet. Each execution fed the pressure instead of relieving it. The more he punished, the more the unseen weight pressed back, equal and opposing, like a balance refusing to tip. This was not opposition born of fear. It was restraint. And restraint, to Hanzo Hasashi, was an insult. In the spaces between battles, the world grew unervingly still. The constant screams dulled, as if muffled behind thick walls. Even the ambient agony of the realm, its ever-present hum, seemed to listen. Hanzo stood amid scorched ruins and realized, with a flash of rage so sharp it bordered on clarity, that he was no longer the loudest thing here. Something was measuring him, not by the scale of his hatred, but by the direction of it. Images began to surface unbidden. Not memories, he would have recognized those, but vision stripped of context. A burning wheel rolling endlessly across empty ground. Chains wrapped not around enemies, but around scales suspended in darkness. A skull wreathed in flame that was not his own, staring back at him from a void that felt older than the Netherrealm itself. Each image vanished the moment he tried to seize it, leaving behind only the sensation of being observed. Hanzo snarled into the dark, demanding an enemy to strike. None answered. The silence that followed was deliberate. The next soul he judged did not scream. It was a small thing, barely a presence at all, a lesser tyrant whose crimes were numerous but uninspired. When the chains pierced him and hellfire took hold, the flame slowed, folding inward instead of exploding outward. The man's eyes widened not in pain, but in recognition. In those last seconds, Hanzo felt something pass through him. Cold, precise, invasive. The fire did not consume the soul. It examined it, and when the judgment ended, what remained was not ash, but nothing at all, as if the man had been removed rather than destroyed. Hanzo staggered back, fury surging at the theft of sensation. That moment, where the scream should have been, was where release once lived. Without it, the act felt incomplete, hollow. He realized then that something had changed the rules without asking him. The voice came not as sound, but as alignment. His thoughts straightened, sharpened, arranged along a logic that was not born of emotion. It did not speak his name. It did not need to. It knew him already, not as Hanzo Hasashi, but as a function, a constant, a force refined by loss and incapable of mercy. The realization cut deeper than any wound. He was not being tempted. He was being evaluated for compatibility. The spirit of vengeance did not explain itself. Explanation implied negotiation. Instead, it pressed its nature against his, testing boundaries. Hanzo felt every soul he had burned echo back through him. Each act of punishment weighed not by his pain, but by its necessity. For the first time since his death, something looked at his rage and asked whether it served balance, or merely perpetuated itself. He rejected the question instinctively. Balance had never saved his family. Balance had never stayed a blade or spared a child. Balance was a word spoken by those who still had the luxury of believing the world corrected itself. Hanzo's existence was proof that it did not. If the universe required balance, then it had already failed him. The presence did not withdraw. It adjusted. The fire around Hanzo's skull deepened into a richer, more deliberate blaze, no longer flickering with emotion, but burning with purpose. The chains lengthened. Links were forming into something heavier, etched with symbols that were not of the nether realm. He felt the weight of them not just in his hands, but in his spine, his thoughts, his sense of direction. Paths open before him. Realms he had never walked, evils that had never known fear. The offer was not freedom. It was scope. In that moment, Hanzo understood the trap embedded in the choice. Acceptance would give his vengeance meaning beyond himself. Rejection would leave him as he was, eternally burning, eternally unfinished. The spirit of vengeance did not demand obedience. It simply made clear that refusing would change nothing. The fire would keep burning. The rage would keep widening. And eventually it would consume even him. So Hanzo did not kneel. He did not beg. He reached out and took hold of the chains as they reshaped themselves, his grip tightening until the metal groaned. If vengeance was to be measured, then he would redefine the scale. If judgment required a host, then it would wear his fury, not temper it. Somewhere, far beyond the hell he knew, an ancient force accepted the answer without approval or regret. The fire flared not higher, but farther. The transformation did not feel like ascension. It felt like containment. Hellfire that had once spilled outward now folded in on itself, compressing until every flame burned with surgical intensity. Hanzo's skull did not blaze brighter. It burned steadier, as if the fire had learned restraint without losing heat. The chains fused more completely into him, not merely weapons but conduits, each link humming with resonance that vibrated through bone and thought alike. He could feel the weight of judgment now, not as a concept, but as a constant pressure behind every decision. Vengeance no longer surged unchecked. It waited. That waiting was unbearable. Hanzo tested the boundaries immediately. He moved through the nether realm with deliberate violence, striking faster, harder, seeking the old release. The fire answered, but it no longer obeyed impulse. It curved. It adjusted. It spared when sparing served some unseen calculus, and annihilated when annihilation was deemed sufficient. Each deviation scraped against us like a blade drawn slowly across stone. This was not partnership. It was coexistence under constraint. The spirit did not correct him. It allowed him to feel the consequences. Souls judged under this new fire did not always burn away. Some were stripped, peeled open until their guilt lay bare, then cast aside, alive, screaming, changed. Others were erased so thoroughly that even the netherrealm seemed to forget them, their absence leaving a hollow in the air that refused to close. Hanzo felt each outcome echo through him, every judgment feeding a ledger he could sense but not read. The act of vengeance was no longer the end. It was part of a process he did not control. He hated that more than anything. The netherrealm responded to him differently now. Pathways bent toward his presence. Barriers that once resisted him fell away without effort. At the edges of his vision, reality thinned, revealing glimpses of places beyond. Cities drowning in corruption, thrones built on unpunished blood, beings whose crimes had calcified into law. The scope was intoxicating and infuriating in equal measure. Every vision was a reminder that his rage had always been too small for what the world deserved. The spirit was not expanding him. It was revealing how limited he had been. Yet for all that power, something vital was being taken. In moments of stillness, rare, stolen moments, Hanzo realized he could no longer remember what it felt like to act without consequence. Every movement carried weight now. Not moral weight as philosophers spoke of it, but cosmic inertia. Choice had become calculation, whether he acknowledged it or not. Even his hatred felt altered, filtered through a purpose that was not born of his suffering. The fire no longer mirrored his pain. It evaluated it. That realization frightened him in a way nothing else had. He struck out at a being older than the realms he knew, a creature whose existence was defined by endless consumption and carefully curated cruelty. This was not a foe of his past, not a name whispered in his memories. This was evil as infrastructure, harm as a system sustained over millennia. When Hanzo's chains wrapped around it, the spirit surged fully for the first time. The fire did not roar. It went silent. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then judgment fell, not as destruction, but as revelation. The creature was forced to experience the totality of its own harm. Every consequence collapsed into a single, unbearable instant. Hanzo felt it too. The weight nearly crushed him. When it ended, the creature remained, broken and emptied, no longer capable of perpetuating its design. It lived, but it was finished. Hanzo tore the chains free with a snarl, fury blazing anew. That was not vengeance. That was correction. He had not come back from hell to balance equations. He had come back to burn. The spirit did not respond. It did not need to. The silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand. In that quiet, Hanzo understood the truth he had been avoiding since the fire changed. This power would never allow him to remain what he was. Every act would pull him further from the raw, untempered rage that had defined him. The spirit was not erasing his vengeance. It was refining it. And refinement was another word for loss. The realms beyond the nether realm began to bleed into his awareness. He could feel the pull of other worlds now, the thrum of injustice resonating like distant thunder. Somewhere far away, crimes were being committed that would never reach his ears through mortal means. Yet the fire knew. The chains strained toward them. Judgment wanted to move. Hanzo stood at the edge of that pull, flames licking the air around him, and felt the last fragile boundary between himself and something far greater begin to thin. He could remain where he was, fighting within familiar hells, clinging to a vengeance he still recognized. Or he could follow the pull and let the fire carry him into realms where his rage would no longer be personal, only necessary. He did not choose immediately, but the road was already opening. And somewhere beyond the fire and chains, beyond hell and memory, an engine roared into being, its wheels waiting for a rider who could no longer pretend this was still just as war. The sound reached him before the sight did. Not the scream of engines or the roar of flame, but vibration so low it felt like pressure inside the skull. A rhythm, a heartbeat that did not belong to any living thing. The netherrealm recoiled from it instinctively, shadows stretching thin, as if pulled by gravity they did not understand. Hanzo turned toward the sensation with his chains already tightening in his hands. Every instinct screaming threat, challenge, inevitability. The machine emerged from darkness without ceremony. It was not forged in the netherrealm. That much was immediately clear. Its presence disrupted the realm's cadence. Its existence imposed rather than integrated. Steel, black and beyond recognition, formed its frame, etched with scars that were not decorative but accumulative. Each one marking a judgment carried out somewhere else, in some other age. Wheels rimmed in hellfire hovered just above the ground, never quite touching it, as if refusing to acknowledge the surface beneath them. Chains coiled around its spine like vertebrae, humming with the same resonance now embedded in Hanzo's own bones. The motorcycle waited. No voice invited him forward. No command echoed in his thoughts. The spirit of vengeance did not instruct. It aligned. The machine was not transport. It was function made physical, momentum given form. Hanzo understood in the same instant that terrified him. This was not an addition to his power. It was a direction. When he approached, the fire around his skull reacted differently again, flaring along lines that mirrored the machine's contours. His chains tugged forward, eager, synchronized. The sensation was intimate and invasive, like recognizing a missing limb you never knew had been severed. Mounting it would not make him stronger. It would make him faster. Faster than reflection. Faster than doubt. He hesitated. In that pause, memories surfaced unbidden. His wife's face, not as she died, but as she lived, quiet, steady, grounding him to something smaller than rage. His clan's banners, not burning, but standing. These memories had survived hell, survived fire, survived death itself. They were fragile, but they were his. He knew, with a clarity that cut deeper than judgment, that once he crossed his threshold, those memories would no longer guide him. They would be fuel at best, weight at worst. The spirit did not intervene. That, more than anything, confirmed the truth. This power did not care who he had been. It cared only that he moved forward. Hanzo swung onto machine in a single motion, chains settling naturally at his sides, as if they had always belonged there. The moment his weight shifted, the engine ignited, not with noise but with intent. Hellfire surged along the frame, synchronizing with the blaze in his skull until there was no clear boundary between rider and ride. The netherrealm peeled away around him, reality stretching, thinning, bending under acceleration that defied distance. The first realm he crossed was not chosen. It was selected. He tore to the boundary between worlds in a cascade of flame and pressure, emerging into a city drowning in quiet corruption. Towers rose like monuments to indifference, their foundations soaked in blood no one remembered. Criminal syndicates ruled openly here, protected by systems that had long ago mistaken order for justice. Hanzo did not slow. The fire did not ask permission. The chains moved before thought, lashing outward, judgment falling with terrifying efficiency. This time, there was no hesitation. The spirit flowed through him fully now, not dominating, not retreating, but coexisting in a state that felt dangerously close to harmony. Each guilty soul ignited the fire hotter, cleaner, more precise. The motorcycle left scorched tracks not on the ground, but on the moral fabric of the world itself. Fear spread faster than flame. Names were whispered, prayers faltered, and still it was not enough. As the last tyrant fell and silence reclaimed the streets, Hanzo felt the pull again, stronger now, clearer. Other worlds, other evils, a horizon that did not end. This was not a mission. It was a circuit, an endless route defined not by revenge, but by necessity. Hanzo looked down at his hands, at the chains glowing with judgment not entirely his own, and understood the cost he had already paid. There would be no final enemy, no moment of completion. Vengeance had evolved into function, and function did not stop when the pain eased. He revved the engine once, the sound ripping through the air like a challenge hurled at the cosmos itself. If balance was what the spirit demanded, then Hanzo Hasashi would give it fire. And if the universe burned in the process, then it would finally understand what it had created. The more worlds he crossed, the less they felt distinct. Corruption wore different masks, spoke different languages, justified itself through culture, law, or divinity, but the shape beneath it was always the same. Systems that fed on suffering while pretending to prevent it. Powers that insulated themselves from consequence by placing distance between decision and damage. Hanzo did not need explanations anymore. The fire reacted before thought, the chains moving with a certainty that frightened even him. Judgment had become reflex. At first, the guilty screamed. They pleaded in every way imaginable. Some begged in terror, others in outrage, convinced that authority or tradition would protect them. Kings invoked bloodlines. Warlords cited necessity. Gods, lesser and greater, spoke of cosmic order, of balance maintained through sacrifice that never included themselves. The spirit listened to all of it with perfect stillness. Hanzo listened to none of it. He had learned, long ago, that justification was just another form of delay. Yet with each execution, something subtle shifted inside him. The satisfaction he once felt, The brief, violent clarity that followed vengeance no longer arrived. The fire burned cleanly, efficiently, without indulgence. There was no excess, no release. Judgment concluded, and the world moved on. That absence gnawed at him more deeply than resistance ever had. Vengeance without catharsis was not what he'd been forged for. It felt like being hollowed out while still in motion. The spirit did not correct this. It allowed it. World began to react before he arrived. Crime syndicates scattered. Tyrants fortified themselves behind rituals and relics that promise immunity. Entire cities sank into paranoia, hunting shadows and accusing innocents in desperate attempts to appease a force they could not understand. Hanzo watched this from the edge of his perception as he rode, the engine's rhythm steady and indifferent. Fear spread faster than justice ever had, and that troubled him in ways fire could not erase. He began to sense resistance from the spirit, not opposition, but caution. Certain targets did not pull at him as strongly as others. Some evils registered as dense but stable, entrenched in structures so vast that destroying them outright would collapse more than they corrected. When Hanzo pushed toward these anyway, the chains grew heavier, the fire more resistant. It was the same restraint he had felt before, now scaled to a cosmic level. This time, he did not explode in rage. He slowed. The realization struck him with brutal clarity. The spirit of vengeance was not interested in ending evil. It was interested in regulating it, in pruning extremes, in maintaining a balance that allowed the cycle to continue. Endless judgment required endless transgression. A universe cleansed completely would leave no purpose for either of them. That truth felt like betrayal. Hanzo veered off the prescribed path for the first time since mounting the machine. The engine protested, its rhythm stuttering, flames flaring erratically. He forced it anyway, dragging the fire to a realm the spirit resisted acknowledging, a place ruled by mortal beings who had not committed crimes in the conventional sense, but whose indifference had shaped centuries of suffering. Their hands were clean, their consequences were not. The confrontation was immediate and violent. The chain struck, but they did not bite as deeply. Judgment hesitated, calculations grinding against Hanzo's will. He pushed harder, pouring every fragment of his original rage into the strike. The fire screamed the first time since their union, raw and unstable. The impact shattered more than flesh. It fractured alignment. For an instant, the spirit pulled back. Hanzo felt it like sudden vacuum, the crushing absence of pressure that had become constant. The fire around his skull flared wildly, uncontrolled, closer to the inferno he remembered. The chains burned white-hot in his hands, no longer guided, no longer tempered. In that moment of separation, he understood the danger of what he had done. Without the spirit's restraint, his vengeance did not correct. It annihilated. The immortals did not fall. The realm itself began to tear. Hanzo wrenched the chains free and retreated instinctively, the engine howling as he tore back through collapsing space. The spirit surged back into alignment just as the fabric of the world snapped shut behind them, sealing disaster away at the cost of something neither of them could name. Silence followed, not the deliberate silence of judgment, but the uneasy quiet of something nearly broken. Hanzo rode on, fire dimming now, the engine's rhythm uneven. The spirit did not chastise him. It did not explain. It simply recalibrated, boundaries shifting subtly, routes adjusting to avoid similar fractures. Hanzo felt the implications settle into his bones. He was not just a rider. He was a variable the spirit could no longer fully predict. And unpredictability, in a system built on balance, was the beginning of catastrophe. Ahead of him, the road stretched on, endless and narrowing at the same time. Judgment awaited. So did conflict. Not with criminals or tyrants, but with the force that had chosen him. Vengeance had found vengeance, and neither of them was prepared for what came next. The spirit grew quieter after that, not weaker, but more distant, as if it were listening to something beyond Hanzo now instead of speaking through him. The fire still burned, the chains still answered, but the certainty that once guided every strike had thinned into something colder and more deliberate. Judgment no longer surged forward. It waited, and waiting gave Hanzo time to think, which was something vengeance had never encouraged. He began to notice the cracks, not in worlds, but in consequences. Cities he had passed through months earlier had changed in ways that unsettled him. Crime had not vanished. It had adapted. Violence had become quieter, more systemic, folded into bureaucracy and ritual. Tyrants learned to delegate suffering so thoroughly that no single soul carried enough guilt to ignite the chains. Entire populations participated in cruelty, diluted across millions of small acts, each one insignificant alone, catastrophic together. The spirit registered these places as ambient corruption, background noise too vast to resolve into targets. Hanzo hated that more than open evil. He started intervening differently. Instead of hunting singular monsters, he disrupted mechanisms. He shattered courts, burned records, dragged hidden decision-makers into light, even when their individual sins barely registered. The chains moved sluggishly when he did this, reluctant, as if forced through mud. The spirit resisted not because the acts were unjust, but because they destabilized systems faster than judgment could rebalance them. Worlds did not collapse. They convulsed. Power vacuums formed. Old regimes fell without replacements ready. Civil wars ignited where fear rushed to fill the absence of control. Hanzo watched this unfold with a tightening in his chest that felt uncomfortably like responsibility. He had spent his life punishing those who caused suffering. Now he was confronting reality that removing them did not guarantee relief. Sometimes it simply changed who screamed first. The spirit began to push back more clearly then. It manifested not as words, but as resistance embedded into the fire itself. Certain paths burned colder. Certain strikes demanded more effort. The chains would pause midair, vibrating with tension, forcing Hanzo to pour more into them than he ever had before. Each time he overrode that resistance, something within the spirit recalculated, as if updating a risk assessment that increasingly centered on him. Hanzo understood the implication before the spirit did. He was becoming a threat to the balance the spirit existed to preserve. That realization did not slow him. It sharpened him. He sought out places where the spirit's pull grew weakest, where judgment hesitated not because of innocence, but because of ambiguity. Border realms, forgotten pantheons, institutions that had outlived the ethics that once justified them. In these places, the fire behaved unpredictably, flaring brighter or dimmer without pattern. Hanzo adapted, learning to read the burn not as instruction, but as constraint. The spirit responded by narrowing his reach. Routes that once opened easily became difficult to access. The engine stalled more often, requiring effort to reignite. On several occasions, Hanzo felt the spirit attempting to redirect him subtly, steering him toward easier prey, cleaner judgments that restored equilibrium without disruption. He ignored it every time. The tension finally broke on a world that should not have mattered. It was small, peripheral, ruled by an immortal council whose authority was ceremonial rather than absolute. They committed no atrocities directly. They simply maintained traditions that ensured suffering remained orderly and predictable. Generations lived and died beneath rules no one remembered choosing. The spirit barely reacted to place at all. Hanzo did. He walked instead of riding, the fire contained, chains coiled at his sides like restrained animals. He listened. He watched. He felt the weight of countless lives pressed flat by inertia rather than malice. When he finally acted, he did not strike the council. He spoke to them. That alone fractured something fundamental. The spirit recoiled, fire surging in warning. Judgment was not meant to converse. It was meant to conclude. Hanzo ignored it, forcing the words out through teeth clenched against rising heat. He named consequences. He named complicity. He named the quiet cruelty of survival, without dignity. The council reacted with confusion first, then fear, not because of his power, but because of the implication that they could be judged for what they had allowed rather than what they had done. When they refused a change, the spirit surged forward violently, attempting to seize control. Hanzo resisted. The internal struggle was immediate and catastrophic. Fire roared uncontrolled, chains lashing erratically, the engine screaming though he was not mounted. The world around him began to warp, structures buckling under metaphysical strain. Judgment and vengeance pulled in opposite directions for the first time since their union. neither willing to yield. In that moment, Hanzo understood the final truth. The spirit of vengeance had not chosen him because he was perfect. It had chosen him because it believed his rage could be harnessed. It was wrong. Hanzo wrenched control back, not through anger, but through refusal. He stopped moving. He stopped striking. He let the fire burn without direction, absorbing the pain of it, grounding himself in the memory of loss rather than the impulse to punish. The spirit faltered, unprepared for stillness. Its calculations depended on motion, on action and reaction. Paused. It had no framework. The fire dimmed. The chains fell slack. For the first time since becoming the Ghost Rider, Hanzo stood without judgment or vengeance guiding him, sustained only by his own will. The spirit did not leave. It could not. But its dominance cracked, reduced from command to presence. The council fled. The world did not end. Change began slowly, painfully without spectacle. Hanzo remounted afterward, the engine quieter now, its rhythm altered. The spirit remained, wary and subdued, no longer certain it was in control of the weapon it had forged. They rode on together, bound but misaligned, toward a future neither fully understood. Somewhere ahead waited a reckoning that would not be decided by guilt alone. It would be decided by choice. The road changed after that, though Hanzo could not say how at first. It was not the worlds themselves, nor the enemies that waited on them. It was the silence between destinations. The engine no longer hummed with eager purpose. It idled patient, as if aware that movement now required consent rather than instinct. The fire burned lower, tighter to the bone, no longer spilling outward in constant demand. When Hanzo rode, he felt the weight of every mile, every decision, settle into him instead of being carried away by flame. The spirit watched, not with eyes, but with pressure, a constant presence behind his thoughts, testing boundaries it no longer fully owned. When Hanzo considered intervening, the chain stirred faintly, gauging intent. Not guilt, intent. That alone told him how much had changed. The spirit had always responded to sin like dry fuel to a spark. Now it hesitated, as if waiting to see whether Hanzo would justify action himself. That hesitation frightened it. They reached places the spirit had never guided him toward before. Regions where evil was diffuse, where suffering was systemic and normalized, too spread out to ignite into judgment. Corporate empires that trafficked in lives without ever touching blood. Divine hierarchies that fed on worship extracted through fear rather than violence. Entire dimensions built on contracts, so ancient no one remembered signing them. In these places, the spirit's pull was faint, almost absent, like a compass losing magnetism. Hanzo felt something else instead. Disgust, not the sharp, satisfying clarity of hatred, but a slow-burning revulsion that had no outlet. These were not monsters that could be dragged screaming into hellfire. They were structures, traditions, equilibriums maintained through shared participation. To burn them all would be to burn everyone. For the first time since his death, Hanzo considered restraint not as weakness, but as strategy. He chose targets carefully now. Not the most guilty, but the most influential. Not the loudest tyrants, but the quiet fulcrums on which systems turned. When he struck, he did so with precision, exposing truths rather than annihilating bodies. The chains learned new shapes under his will, binding records, ripping secrets into the open, forcing consequences without total collapse. Each act required effort. Each act cost him. The fire scorched inward, searing memory and bone alike, punishing deviation from pure vengeance. The spirit endured this only because it had no alternative. It could not abandon him without losing its foothold in the material worlds he now traversed. And yet, it could not fully dominate him without risking fracture. Their bond had become a negotiation conducted through pain and silence, each side testing how far the other would bend before breaking. Others began to notice. Not heroes, not gods, wardens, cosmic arbiters who had grown comfortable with predictable cycles of sin and punishment. They sensed disruption where order once reigned, judgment delayed, vengeance misapplied, outcomes no longer aligning with expectation. Whispers followed Hanzo's passage, not of terror, but in balance, of a rider who did not behave correctly. They came to observe him first, then to confront. One such entity appeared at the edge of a dying star, manifesting as a figure of blinding symmetry, every angle precise, every motion measured. It spoke in verdicts rather than words, outlining the necessity of the spirit's function, the danger of deviation. Hanzo listened, unmoved. When it finished, he responded simply that systems built to preserve balance at the expense of justice deserve disruption. The entity attempted to seize control of the spirit directly. It failed. The spirit resisted violently, flaring in defiance, not out of loyalty to Hanzo, but out of self-preservation. Whatever leash once bound at a higher authority had frayed when it bound itself to a soul that could say no. The confrontation ended without battle, the entity withdrawing to reassess a variable it had never accounted for, a ghost rider who could choose. The repercussions echoed outward. Other riders felt it, a subtle shift in the metaphysical current that sustained them. Some burned brighter, invigorated by the idea of autonomy they had never known. Others suffered, their bonds destabilizing as the spirit recalculated its relationship to every host. Judgment across the multiverse wavered, not collapsing, but faltering just enough to be noticed. Hanzo felt their pain and did not apologize. He understood now what the spirit truly feared. Not disobedience, but evolution. A rider who acted not as an extension of cosmic law, but as a conscience that could weigh consequence against cause. Such a being could not be predicted, could not be optimized, could not be safely deployed. He rode on regardless, the fire dim but unyielding, chains heavy with purpose rather than impulse. Somewhere ahead waited a final confrontation, not with an enemy, but with the spirit itself. Not a battle for dominance, but a reckoning over what judgment was meant to be when wielded by a soul that refused absolutes. And when that moment came, Hanzo knew the fire would not decide the outcome. He would. The reckoning did not announce itself with thunder or flame. It arrived quietly, as most irreversible things do, in a place where the boundaries between worlds had thinned from neglect rather than damage. A crossroads that existed only because enough beings believed it should, layered with forgotten treaties and abandoned vows. The ground was neither stone nor ash, but something softer like compressed memory, yielding slightly under Hanzo's boots when he dismounted. The engine died without protest. For once, it did not resist stillness. The spirit surfaced fully there, not as a voice and not as fire, but as presence given shape by necessity. It unfolded within him and around him at the same time, an inversion of space that made the air feel too close to the skin. Hanzo felt every mile they had traveled together coiled tight behind his ribs. Every scream carried by the chains. Every soul reduced to fuel. The spirit did not accuse. It did not plead. It presented accounting. This is what you were made to do. The meaning pressed into him, heavy and absolute. The spirit showed him futures like reflections in dark glass. One where it reclaimed dominance and judgment returned to efficiency, clean and relentless. One where Hanzo's resistance fractured the bond entirely, unleashing uncontrolled hellfire that would scour indiscriminately until another host was found. One where balance collapsed slowly, systems failing not through rebellion, but through hesitation, as vengeance lost its certainty. None of them felt like justice. Hanzo answered not with denial, but with memory. He let the spirit feel the village that burned while he was away. The weight of a child's name he never learned. The way rage had sustained him until it hollowed him out. He showed the spirit what it had mistaken for purity. Vengeance stripped of mercy did not resolve suffering. It perpetuated it endlessly, feeding on its own aftermath. The spirit recoiled, not in pain, but in recalibration. This data did not fit its core function. It had been shaped by eons of binary judgment, guilt and innocence, sin and retribution. Hanzo's experience introduced a variable it had never integrated fully, consequence beyond punishment. You weaken the fire, the spirit pressed, less certain now. Without certainty, judgment fails. Hanzo stepped forward into the pressure, letting it scorch what remained of his fear. Without choice, he said, voice steady despite the heat crawling up his spine, judgment is just machine pretending to be moral. For a moment that stretched longer than time should allow, Nothing happened. The crossroads trembled, layers of reality slipping slightly out of alignment as if the universe itself waited to see which interpretation would hold. Hanzo felt the chains grow warm, not in hunger, but in tension. The spirit was not attacking. It was considering. Then it did something unprecedented. It yielded, not completely, not willingly, but enough. The fire contracted, no longer flooding every thought. The chains loosened their perpetual readiness, responding only when Hanzo reached for them deliberately. The spirit retreated into a secondary position within him. Still present, still powerful, but no longer absolute. It accepted a limitation not because it agreed, but because it recognized survival and adaptation. The crossroads stabilized. Futures collapsed into possibility rather than inevitability. Hanzo exhaled, a breath he felt he had been holding since the day he died. The pain did not vanish. It became quieter, more precise. The fire still burned, but now it answered a restraint as much as wrath. Judgment had not been destroyed. It had been contextualized. They left the crossroads without ceremony. Word spread anyway, not in proclamations, but in anomalies. Riders whose flames dimmed when they questioned an order. Spirits that hesitated where once they surged. Systems of cosmic enforcement registering increased variance without identifiable cause. The universe adjusted around the disturbance Hanzo represented, absorbing it slowly, cautiously, the way a body accommodates a foreign object it cannot expel. Some saw him as a failure, others as a threat. A few, quietly, saw possibility. Hanzo did not seek them out. He rode with fire aloud and walked where it did not. He chose battles that mattered even when they would never be remembered. He accepted that some evils could not be burned away without replacing them with something worse. In those cases, he left marks instead, truths exposed, illusions cracked, people forced to see the cost of what they sustained. The spirit remained, watchful and altered, learning alongside him in ways it never had with any host before. It no longer whispered commands. It listened. Somewhere ahead, there would be consequences for this compromise, entities that would not tolerate uncertainty, forces that depended on rigid judgment to justify their existence. Hanzo did not doubt that conflict was coming. He simply no longer believed that outcome was predetermined. The road stretched on, darker and less defined than before. But for the first time since the fire claimed him, Hanzo felt something that did not burn. Direction. Direction did not mean clarity. It meant weight. Every choice now pressed back against Hanzo instead of dissolving into flame. And that weight followed him as he rode into territories the spirit once avoided entirely. Places where judgment had failed so completely that even vengeance had learned to look away. The engine carried him there reluctantly, its growl low and uneven, as if aware that what waited ahead could not be solved by fire alone. The first of these places was a city built around a promise that had expired. It rose in tiers of pale stone and corroded steel, its skyline pierced by monuments to those no one still remembered making. Every law here was enforced flawlessly. Crime was nearly non-existent. Suffering was efficient, evenly distributed, optimized to maintain order, without provoking revolt. The spirit barely stirred as Hanzo entered, registering no significant concentration of guilt. By its measure, this place was clean. Hanzo felt sick. He walked the streets without burning, the skull beneath his mask dim, his chains wrapped tight around his arms like manacles. People passed him without fear, some without even looking. They were not oppressed by violence. They were flattened by expectation. Lives spent fulfilling roles that no longer served any living purpose. Enforced not by cruelty, but by tradition so old it had become invisible. This was the future the spirit protected when it acted alone. Hanzo sought the source, not a tyrant, but a mechanism. He found it in a chamber beneath the city, a vast archive where contracts older than the buildings themselves were stored and renewed automatically by servitor priests long since stripped of identity. The machine at the center did not threaten him. It did not defend itself. It simply continued, executing instructions written by hands long turned to dust. The spirit urged restraint, not forceful but cautious. The structure it conveyed maintained equilibrium. Disrupting it would produce suffering that could not be neatly accounted for. Hanzo understood the risk. He also understood the cost of leaving it intact. He did not destroy the machine. He interrupted it. The chains moved slowly, carefully, guided not by fury but by intent. They wrapped around data conduits and seal-stamped tablets, freezing processes mid-cycle. Systems stuttered. Servitors paused, confused, incapable of adaptation. Above, the city did not erupt into chaos. It hesitated. For the first time in generations, nothing told it what to do next. Hanzo left without watching what followed. He did not need to. Change born of uncertainty would be painful, but it would be real. The spirit absorbed this outcome silently, recalculating again, forced to acknowledge that equilibrium in force without consent was not balance, but stasis. Others were less patient. They came to him not as enemies at first, but as corrections, entities whose existence depended on predictability. They confronted him in thresholds and dead zones, where reality folded neatly enough for absolutes to function. They accused him of destabilizing frameworks that prevented greater catastrophes. Hanzo did not argue. He simply asked them how many lives were acceptable collateral for a system that no longer remembered why it existed. They had no answer. Conflict followed, but it was different from anything Hanzo had known. No grand battles. No apocalyptic clashes. These were contests of pressure and consequence, where every exertion rippled outward, threatening damage far beyond the immediate exchange. Hanzo learned to disengage rather than dominate, to retreat rather than escalate. The spirit adapted again, its fire refining, burning only when Hanzo committed fully. That restraint cost him allies. Some riders broke from their spirits entirely, bonds snapping under the strain of conflicting directives. Others doubled down, becoming more ruthless, more efficient, trying to prove that certainty still worked. Judgment across the multiverse fractured into philosophies rather than rules. The old uniformity never returned. And still Hanzo rode. He became a rumor that frightened systems more than monsters. A rider who arrived without fire and left without closure. A force that did not cleanse, but destabilized. Worlds learned to fear not his wrath, but his questions. Institutions collapsed not because he burned them, but because he revealed the emptiness beneath their authority. The spirit remained with him through it all, quieter now, less confident, but no longer hostile. It learned what Hanzo had always known in his bones, that vengeance was easy, responsibility was not. The road narrowed as it went on, less defined, less forgiving. Somewhere ahead waited the final consequence of their compromise. Not annihilation, not absolution, but reckoning in its truest form, the moment when choice would demand a cost that could not be externalized. Hanzo did not slow. For the first time since hellfire claimed his soul, he understood that justice was not something you delivered. It was something you carried. And it was heavy. The weight announced itself before the place did. Hanzo felt it as resistance in the air, a drag that made each step heavier than the last, as if the world ahead was less willing to accept him than those he had already passed through. The engine refused to ignite, no matter how much we poured into it. The spirit did not fight him. It simply did not assist. This, Hanzo realized, was a destination that could only be reached on foot. The ground was scarred by the aftermath of choices rather than battles. Cracked earth stitched together, with old scorch marks. Ruins that did not belong to any single civilization, layered one atop another, as if time itself had collapsed into a single grave. This was a convergence point, a place where consequences accumulated when nowhere else would hold them. Systems broken by intervention, equilibriums disrupted and never replaced. The fallout of decisions made by beings powerful enough to walk away. Hanzo knew, with a certainty that settled cold and deep, that some of that fallout belonged to him. He moved through remnants of worlds he recognized only by feeling. A council chamber reduced to rubble, its symbols shattered beyond recognition. A shrine stripped bare, its faith dispersed into 1,000 conflicting interpretations. A battlefield where no bodies remained, only impressions in the ground where something immense had stood and then chosen to leave. Each fragment carried an echo, not of suffering inflicted, but of responsibility deferred. The spirit stirred uneasily, not in warning, in acknowledgement. This place had not been built to judge Hanzo. It existed because judgment had been avoided too often by too many. Here, the cause of disruption lingered long enough to be faced. Hanzo felt the pull in his chest, the accumulated weight of every time he had walked away believing uncertainty was better than control. He still believed that, but belief did not erase consequence. At the center of the convergence stood something that resembled neither throne nor altar, but a mirror formed from fractured space. It reflected not his face, but outcomes. Cities still burning years after he had exposed their rot without offering guidance. Populations freed from tyrants only to fracture along old fault lines. Children raised in the aftermath of upheaval, inheriting confusion rather than clarity. None of these futures accuse him. They simply existed. Hanzo stood before them, without turning away. The spirit pressed closer then, not to seize control, but to share burden. For the first time since their bond had shifted, it offered something without demand. Context. It showed him the futures that would have unfolded if he had chosen differently. Ones where he had burned systems entirely, imposed new orders through force. Those futures were quieter, more stable. They were also brittle, dependent on constant enforcement, forever one failure away from collapse. Neither path was clean. Hanzo understood then that the spirit's original certainty had not been cruelty. It had been efficiency. And efficiency had its own mercy, however cold. What he had chosen instead was messier, slower. It asked more of those left behind. It asked them to decide what came next. The mirror shifted. One final reflection surfaced, not of a world, but Hanzo himself, stripped of flame and chain, walking away from his convergence and leaving it unresolved like so many others. The implication was clear. He could continue as he had, carrying justice imperfectly, accepting fallout as inevitable. Or he could stay, take responsibility for what his interventions had left unfinished, and be diminished by it. To stay meant sacrifice without spectacle. No hellfire, no judgment, just labor. Hanzo knelt. The ground was cold and unyielding beneath him, and for the first time since becoming the Ghost Rider, he felt small. He did not burn the convergence. He did not seal it away. He anchored himself to it, pouring will not into destruction, but into stabilization. The chains did not lash outward. They sank into fractured terrain, binding fragments together, slowing collapse without imposing order. The spirit recoiled at first, then adjusted, its fire thinning into threads of containment rather than punishment. This was not what it had been made for, but it worked. Time passed strangely there. Hanzo did not know how long he remained, reinforcing weak points, mitigating consequences he could not erase. He did not fix everything. He could not, but he prevented further unraveling. When he finally stood, the convergence was quieter, less volatile, no longer growing. He was weaker. The fire burned lower than it ever had. The chains fell heavier, less responsive. The engine, when it finally answered his call, sounded strained. The spirit was diminished too, its scope narrowed by the choice it had accepted. Neither of them were what they had been. Hanzo mounted anyway. As he rode away, he did not feel triumph. He felt commitment. The understanding that justice carried responsibly was not a single act, but a willingness to remain when walking away would be easier. The road ahead was darker now, not because hope had faded, but because certainty was gone. Somewhere, systems would adapt. Others would fail. Consequences would ripple outward long after he had passed. Hanzo accepted that without flinching. He no longer believed in perfect outcomes, only in honest ones. The spirit remained silent, no longer guide or master, but witness. Together, they rode on, not as executioner and weapon, but as burden and bearer, moving forward not to end suffering, but to stand where it could no longer be ignored. And that, Hanzo understood, was the cost of choosing justice over vengeance. It did not end the fire. It taught him when not to use it. The fire never left him. It simply learned restraint the way a blade learns its sheath, present but no longer seeking flesh on its own. Hanzo rode onward through spaces that resisted definition, places where consequence gathered like sediment at the edges of reality. He did not arrive to cleanse them. He arrived to endure them, to stand where others would not, to remain present long enough for meaning to form without coercion. Word of him changed as it traveled. Once, he had been described as an omen, a punishment made manifest. Now he was spoken of as something less precise, and therefore more unsettling. A rider who stayed. A judgment that did not conclude. Entire systems learned to fear not his arrival, but his refusal to leave until responsibility had been acknowledged by those who remained alive afterward. There were no rituals for that. No prayers that promised relief. Institutions adapted poorly. Those built on fear collapsed fastest. Unable to function once terror stopped being an endpoint. Others tried to weaponize his presence, baiting him with visible injustice, while hiding deeper rot beneath layers of procedure and consent. Hanzo learned to recognize those patterns too. He ignored the offered sacrifices. He waited. When change came without his hand forcing it, he moved on. When it did not, he stayed until someone else chose to act. The spirit observed all of this in silence. It no longer measured success in bodies or guilt discharged. It measured strain, sustainability, the long arc of consequence rather than the immediacy of retribution. This was not what it had been forged for, but it endured because it had learned the same lesson Hanzo had. That power which could not adapt would eventually shatter itself. They encountered other riders occasionally, their flames sharp with purpose or dangerously unmoored. Some looked at Hanzo with suspicion, others with something close to longing. A few tried to challenge him, mistaking restraint for weakness. Those encounters ended quickly, not with annihilation but with clarity. Hanzo did not need to prove dominance. He needed only to refuse submission. Some riders left afterward, questioning orders they had never realized they were following. Others clung hard to certainty, burning brighter in defiance. Judgment across the multiverse never recovered its old uniformity. It became personal, contextual, uneven, dangerous in new ways, necessary in others. The universe did not thank him. It destabilized. Balance shifted constantly now, no longer maintained by clean equations of sin and punishment. Chaos rose in places that had relied on fear to function. Stability emerged in places where autonomy had been denied for generations. There was no pattern that could be charted cleanly. Only movement, only response. Hanzo accepted that too. He stopped asking whether the spirit had made a mistake in choosing him. The question no longer mattered. What mattered was that the choice had been irreversible, and that something new now existed where a closed system once had. A ghost rider who could say no. A force of judgment that understood mercy not as forgiveness, but as a refusal to simplify harm into something manageable. When Hanzo finally allowed himself to rest, it was not in peace, but in readiness. He sat beside the bike, fire low, chains coiled loosely at his side, watching a horizon that did not promise resolution. He felt the spirit with him, quiet and altered, no longer whispering destiny into his bones. They were bound still, but the bond had become mutual. Somewhere, new atrocities were already unfolding. Others were being prevented quietly by choices no one would ever attribute to him. That anonymity felt right. Justice, he had learned, did not require recognition to function. It required presence. It required endurance. When he mounted again, there was no surge of flame, no roar of inevitability. Just motion, just commitment. Hanzo Hasashi rode on not as vengeance incarnate, but as consequence made conscious. A reminder written into the fabric of existence that judgment without reflection was just another kind of cruelty, and that the hardest burden any power could carry was a responsibility to choose restraint when destruction would be easier. The fire followed, not because it commanded him, but because he let it. The road did not end. It thinned. Paths that once announced themselves with inevitability now appeared only when Hanzo was already upon them, unfolding beneath his wheels or his boots one decision at a time. There were fewer destinations that welcomed him, fewer conflicts that could be resolved by his presence alone. The universe had adjusted to him in the only way it knew how, by making certainty rare. He felt it most strongly in the silence between interventions, not the heavy silence of fear, but the watchful kind, as if reality itself had learned to hesitate. Systems paused when pressure built instead of breaking immediately. Leaders delayed orders. Councils fractured into argument rather than defaulting to violence. None of them knew his name. None of them needed to. The effect was enough. The spirit sensed it too. What it had once enforced through overwhelming finality was now dispersing through influence. Subtle, incomplete, difficult to measure. The spirit struggled with that at times, retreating into old instincts when confronted with atrocity that begged for clean answers. When it surged, Hanzo allowed it, rarely, deliberately, reminding it that restraint was not denial, only timing. Each controlled release reinforced their altered bond, teaching the fire that judgment did not lose meaning when it waited. It gained depth. There were moments Hanzo doubted himself. He stood once on the edge of a world devoured slowly by famine engineered through policy rather than malice. No single soul bore enough guilt to ignite the chains fully. Intervention would have required tearing the system apart and accepting the chaos that followed. He stayed. He watched. He waited. When collapse came anyway, it did so along lines of people themselves had chosen to break. Hanzo did not take credit. He did not take blame. He carried the weight of having been there to see it through. That weight never lessened. It became part of him, as intrinsic as the fire beneath his skin. The skull no longer burned as brightly, but it burned truer, its light cutting inward rather than outward. Those who encountered him rarely screamed now. They stared. Some recognized what he represented instinctively and turned back before crossing lines they could no longer justify to themselves. Others did not, and learned why the chain still existed. Across worlds, across dimensions, the Ghost Rider became something difficult to categorize. Not savior, not executioner. A presence that complicated evil rather than erasing it. The spirit adapted to that role because it had no choice. It had been changed by proximity to a soul that refused absolutes, and change, once introduced, could not be undone. In quieter moments, Hanzo remembered the man he had been before fire and chains, before death and rebirth had stripped his life down to a single purpose. That man had believed vengeance would end his pain. The rider he had become understood now that pain was not something to be ended. It was something to be carried without letting it define the shape of the world. The universe did not reward him for this understanding. It continued to burn, fracture, and rebuild in uneven cycles. Wars still erupted. Tyrants still rose. God still hid behind systems designed to dilute responsibility. Hanzo did not pretend otherwise. He moved through it all with steady resolve, knowing that justice was not an event, but a posture, a way of standing in the presence of harm, without surrendering to the simplicity of destruction. The spirit remained with him to the end of each road and the beginning of the next, no longer a voice of command, but a force tempered by consent. Together, they embodied something unstable, unfinished, and therefore alive. There would never be a final judgment delivered by his hand. There would only be moments where fire was necessary, and moments where it was not. Hanzo Hasashi rode on through those moments, neither forgiven nor condemned, carrying hellfire not as a sentence, but as a responsibility. And in a universe that had grown accustomed to punishment without reflection, that quiet refusal to simplify became its own kind of reckoning. The fire burned, the chains waited, and choice endured.